Hi, welcome to the No More Sex Shame video series. Today we are interviewing Tina Schermer Sellers, who is a sex therapist and has been working at a religious university or college for quite some time. She has a lovely book that I'm highly recommending, Sex, God, and the Conservative Church, Erasing Shame from Sexual Intimacy. And like me, she's one of the people that is really talking a lot about the ways that sexual shame is impacting and hurting people and helping people to overcome it. Tina, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be here, David.
So why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about how you ended up writing this book, how you ended up with sexual shame being an issue that you were dealing with and that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I often say that I didn't set out to do this. You know, most people don't say, hey, let's take on the church and shame. Not something I recommend at all. You know,
there's all these windmills out there you can tilt at, and if you're gonna go after one, it's really the one you want to hit. Yeah.
Right, exactly. You know, I've been directing medical family therapy and been in medicine and doing marriage and family therapy for well over 30 years. But all along the way, I've been teaching the human sexuality course for marriage and family therapists at Seattle Pacific University, where I am an associate professor. And around the year 2000, I began to notice, so I have my students write their sexual autobiography as one of the assignments in that class. And as you know, many therapists believe, and this is certainly true in our program, that you're only ever as good a therapist as you know what your own story is. So throughout our program, we'll have our students write aspects of their story. So if they're studying family of origin work, they might write a bit about their family of origin experience, or I teach a psychopharmacology and medical issues class, so they write their illness story in that class. So in the human sexuality course, they write their sexual autobiography. Well, about 90 to 95% of people in the United States grow up in homes that are virtually silent or silent and shaming around sexuality. So in particular, our sexual narrative really isn't a narrative. It's these spotty events we remember, like, oh, I remember getting in trouble, playing doctor with my cousin when I was 5, or I remember my first kiss or first crush, or, these sort of spotty events. So when I give them about, 60, 70 questions, and I ask them to go back 3 generations and just talk about how gender ideas came down and affection came down and what they actually remember through their childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, then it's forced to be put in a narrative format. And so I've read well over 500 of these in my career. So right around the year 2000, I began to notice a dramatic increase in sexual shame from students, pretty much in general, but particularly in students from conservative religious backgrounds. So I want to say that again, it was general, as well as specific. And I didn't understand what was happening culturally that was causing this shift. I'm 57, so my childhood and adolescence was in the 70s, so post 60s, post second wave feminism, sort of the Jesus movement was going on, which was really kind of like concerts and sex positive time and culture. So I didn't understand how we had taken out a dramatic step backwards. And now students were describing a whole lot of ignorance about their bodies and self-contempt and feelings of humiliation and disgust and a sense of being abnormal and really feeling inferior and unworthy and not knowing what was normal development at all across their life cycle at all. And then describing sexual dysfunction in their relationship, like I had never seen in young people at all. I mean, I had hardly seen in my career. And so I just didn't know why I was seeing this. And actually, it was heartbreaking. I spent the first 3 years that I started to see this in my chair's office crying because the stories were so heartbreaking to me. And the symptoms of many of my students looked exactly like somebody who had experienced childhood sexual abuse. So it was stunning. So it took a while before I started to ask questions like, tell me more about your adolescence, your childhood, what was happening. And what I began to realize was I was hitting the first wave of students that had been impacted by the full range of the abstinence only, quote unquote, education, where we had billions and billions of dollars put into abstinence. And you can't call it education, because it was really the pull of education away, comprehensive education, whatever we had was taken away. And then these quote unquote education programs were put into our public schools. At the same time, we had a profound socio-political blending of religion and politics that had happened beginning in the early 80s. And then in the early 90s, we had a program called True Love Waits that got launched from the Southern Baptist movement that happened across the Protestant churches. And then it went wider into the Catholic, into the LDS churches, and well into Europe, where we had these purity pledges that were signed by well over 4 million people, young kids, in the first 3 years, like from 1992 to 1995. We
That's
had
huge. I had no idea it was so big.
Yeah, across the Capitol Mall in, I think, 1994, where we had a bunch of pledge cards displayed in the Capitol Mall. And this was very different message. It wasn't don't have sex, wasn't just don't have sex until you get married, which of course was penis vagina sex. It was don't think about anything sexual. Don't feel anything sexual. It was be pure in body, mind, heart, and spirit, which was translated don't feel, don't think, don't want, don't do. And if you do, you are cheating against your future partner, and you are hurting your relationship with God.
Oh, wow.
And they were told this as early as 10, 11, 12. They were given, many of them got rings, purity rings that they wore. And so you tell a pre-adolescent child this when they're really earnest, especially I often say that the most earnest and anxious child were the ones that were most hurt, were sexually traumatized through this, because they're just anxiously oriented and they don't want to disappoint anyone. And then of course their body clicks online, as they become 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and you cannot deny, it's like asking someone not to breathe.
Right.
So this internal critic gets going that something is fundamentally wrong with me, and that's shame.
And you're phrasing that as almost equivalent to sexual trauma.
Yes, it is. Because those are the symptoms you see.
Wow. Now, the parents and the teachers and the leaders that were promoting this, and frankly kind of still are. I mean, under the current administration, there's right. Funding now again for the abstinence only kind of programs. What do you think they're thinking? I mean, I don't think they're thinking, oh, we're gonna traumatize all these kids.
Heavens, no. I really believe, and this was certainly the way I wrote my book. I did not write my book in a way that's condemning at all of the church or of people, because I really believe people innocently think that they're doing what's protective. If you think about this, and which is why I have in the book, how did the church become sex negative? Was it ever sex positive? Did it ever have a sexual ethic based in love and justice and mercy and grace? Really what Christianity is originally based in. And I went and actually looked through history to ask if that ever happened. And it didn't. It built its sexual ethic based on the mind-body split, which was already in place with the philosophers from like 300 BC. And then it was about who could deny the body the most. And when Constantine became emperor in the 4th century, he then appointed who were going to become the original church leaders in the early church. Those, of course, were men, and they were the men who were denying the body the most. And that became the sexual ethic. The body was bad, the spirit was good, and we have kept that in place. And we now live in a consumer-based culture that sells the body and doesn't look at the impact of that on relationships either. So we have this dual way in which religion and the consumer culture are in bed together, and it has had a heyday with us. So we've never looked at an integrated body, mind, soul, spirit as a very healing way that we do attachment and connection and pleasure, which is what we're hardwired for. I mean, we come out of the womb seeking connection and pleasure, right?
I call the modern media the anxiety industry, because, you know, their job is to make us nervous so then they can sell us stuff with commercials.
That's right. Make us feel inadequate,
Yeah.
make us feel unworthy.
And that mind-body split is one of the great ways where they can reach out and poke you and make you anxious and nervous. Wow.
That's exactly right. And feel ashamed. Feel shame. I'm unworthy. I'm not good enough the way I am. And if I can feel that way, I'm going to spend more money.
One of the things you did in your book and have been doing in your writing and talking is talking about what sexual shame is. You know, I realize in these interviews I'm talking about sexual shame, but I never really defined it.
Right, exactly. And you know what? I actually had a PhD student come to me about 4 years ago, and she said, you know, Tina, I've been following your work, and I want to do my PhD on religious sexual shame. But when I got into the literature, I realized we did not have an operational definition for sexual shame anywhere in the literature. So I need to do my doctoral dissertation on getting an operational definition for sexual shame. So this actually is research that was just defended this last May. So we have a brand new operational definition of sexual shame. And I can give you the basic components of it.
Sure, please.
Sexual shame is a visceral feeling of humiliation and disgust towards one's own body and identity as a sexual being. It's a belief of being abnormal, inferior, and unworthy. This feeling can be internalized, but it also manifests in our interpersonal relationships, having a negative impact on trust, communication, and physical and emotional intimacy. Sexual shame develops across the lifespan in interactions with interpersonal relationship, one's culture and society, and subsequent critical self-appraisal, which is a continuous feedback loop, right? That's going round and round all the time. There is also a fear and uncertainty related to one's power or right to make decisions, including safety decisions related to sexual encounters. Along with an internalized judgment toward one's own sexual desire. And so this is Noelle Clark, who this was her dissertation. When she defended this, I thought, you know, every clinician I know who's been working around sexuality has seen this in their office over and over and over again. This attacks people at their core ability to attach. To really live out intimacy, connection, and pleasure, however they want to do it in their life, really, you know, but it's right at that place. So I cannot think of another way that you can hurt someone more than to sexually shame them. And yet when you think about it, we start sexually shaming our children pre-verbally. Because the minute they can get under their diaper, they're finding what creates pleasure for them.
And we tell them, oh, you don't do that. That's bad.
We slap their hand away.
Right.
Don't touch that.
Yeah.
Right? And it's only because someone did that to us.
Why? Yeah, I love that definition. I mean, the way that I talk about it with patients is that, you know, shame versus guilt. You know, guilt is kind of about what you do or your behavior, or your choices, and you can sort of fix it and kind of make up or make different choices in the future. Shame is about who you are, and sort of says that these things that you've done reflect how broken and, you know, deficient and bad at a deep core level you are.
Exactly.
And at that level, there's kind of nothing you can do other than try to become something that you're not, or suicide, sadly. And I agree with you. I mean, that's deeply damaging. Why do we do it? Why is shame, especially within religion, why is shame such a kind of knee-jerk kind of control technique?
I don't think that it's cognitive that way. I think it's completely woven into the fabric of who we are. So shame, I think it's important to understand what shame is and how it happens. So we get shamed when we are doing something from a very innocent place. We're usually doing something completely innocent, like finding our genitals, like spilling milk, right? We're doing something innocent, and someone in authority who we love freaks out on us, right? Gets angry with us. And the only conclusion we can come to is, because we don't know what just happened, is that I must be bad. Not what I did, but the me of me must be bad. And like you said, what's different from guilt is I have an ethic, I have a particular ethic, and I just violated my own ethic. I know I don't believe in lying and I just lied. I feel badly about it. Guilt motivates change because I don't want to do that again. Shame doesn't motivate change necessarily. I may not want to feel that again, but I don't even really know what it was because it's me, right? And I can't get away from me. So shame happens when we are just being me, when people are just being themselves, and someone who loves them comes unglued on them. That's how it starts, And so that's the core of shame. And the way then I think it continues is that people then, out of that place of reactivity where they were shamed, they turn around and shame others.
Yeah.
Right?
Certainly seeing that a lot.
Yeah.
Even amongst people who, are fighting against the forces of shame, and then they turn around and shame people within their own community.
Exactly.
Or stepping outside some of the values of that now new community.
Exactly. And so I'm often saying to parents, if you want to do it different with your own children, you've got to deal with your shame first, right? And so you've got to prepare for the fact that your children are going to touch themselves. You've got to prepare for the fact that this is what they're going to be curious about doing at every age, and think about it ahead of time. How was it dealt with in your life? What are the feelings that come up for you? Because shame is going to get triggered, and you have to bring such compassion and love and gentleness to the you that never got that.
So that's how you help people try to overcome that shame, is through gentleness and acceptance of themselves, of those aspects of themselves that were shamed.
Yes, absolutely. Because we didn't deserve for that to happen to us either. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, having curiosity, discovering connection and pleasure is the way that we are hardwired, like sticking a marble in our mouth when we're 2 and discovering how things taste in our mouth is how we're hardwired. We're meant to figure out the world through our senses. People freak out on us. We just don't understand, right? And so we've got these reactions inside of us to do the same to an other. And sometimes we don't even understand why our reactions are so strong. It's shame. And sometimes the core of our arguments with our partners are because they triggered our shame.
Yeah. Now, my research and writing around, pornography and the issues of sex addiction, one of the things that is becoming very, very clear is that a huge majority of the people who are self-identifying as being addicted to pornography come from exactly that background you described. The abstinence-only, conservative, sort of non-sexual kind of framework. They have really negative ideas and attitudes towards pornography, and then they start using pornography, and they've never reconciled the conflict between their values and now their behavior. And every time they then use pornography, or every time they even feel sexual, they now feel awful and ashamed of themselves. And that it's a tough drive to resist, because you want to be sexual. You're interested in this sexual material that's out there.
Absolutely.
And then they identify that interest as being addictive. And it becomes this ugly, awful spiral where then seeing themselves in that way is harmful over time, regardless of how little pornography they use. And that's a lot of what you're talking about is the strategies that a lot of us are trying to employ with those folks, is helping them understand those early messages they got about sex and about porn,
right?
Healing some of these breaches around their own sexuality and self-acceptance.
Right, exactly. In the book, I talk about a model for change, and I talk about frame, name, claim, and aim. And frame is get yourself the scaffolding of sex education. We were 30 years in abstinence only education. In 2005, Bush proposed $270 million that year alone on abstinence only education, just that year. Wow. The research that was done showed that over 80% of the education programs that were instituted across the United States had misinformation in them, sold as scientific information. So things like condoms aren't going to protect you. If you have an abortion, you're going to be sterile. Your future children will be retarded. I mean, all kinds of things. Thinking, 42-day-old embryo as a thinking child. I mean, mixing religion and science in public schools. So this is what I'm talking about, the blending of, religion and the public discourse happened at the beginning of the 80s. And I actually had somebody at the ASECT conference, the Sex Educators Conference, when I was presenting, say, I did not grow up in a religious home, and I got purity education in my public school. And so it really, I know that the title of my book is Sex, God, and the Conservative Church. You could have not grown up in a church-based home and have been very affected if you went through your adolescence in the 90s and later, just because of the kind of abstinence education we had across the United States. And so I think that the kind of information that we have and have not had around has been so damaging to people that people really need to take the time to get accurate information as a place to start, to just clean out the closet of the mythology that has been around and in our media and has been unavailable to people. Then after you have frame, name is find a safe person or group of people to hear the story of what it was like to grow up in your particular family or school, or if you were in any kind of a community group, and what you heard and didn't hear around sexuality, and where was it positive and where was it discouraging and negative, and did you feel free to learn about your sexuality? Research shows that if kids grow up with what I call 101-minute conversations, where it's just an open conversation, it's age appropriate, they learn about it like they learn about brushing their teeth and how to keep your body healthy and what you're going to eat for dinner. If it's just
You just froze.
Are
Oh,
you
you're
there?
back. Good.
Okay.
Okay. Shoot. What I'm wondering is if I start, oh, it's still recording. Okay. Okay. I think we're okay.
Okay. All right.
So you were talking about the ways in which you help people overcome in terms of naming and framing.
Right.
One of the one of the ways I talk to folks about this is, then helping them identify, what kind of sexual being do you want to be now as you are an adult and you look at the values that you've been taught, and now you decide how you want to integrate some of those values and morals into your life with your modern adult kind of understanding that you didn't have back then. It sounds like it sounds kind of close to what you're heading towards.
Yeah, I think once they have sort of a good basis of the education, and then sifting through how is that similar or different than what you were told, and how does that change anything from what you've been thinking and feeling, really just sifting through and then orienting themselves, sort of checking,
Right.
does that shift and change their values or the way that they're thinking? And then I think claim is a piece of that, is like really coming to terms with your body. I think that we have to claim a different relationship with our body. And part of that is the effect of the consumer-based culture on us, both men and women. Women for sure, but men, I think, are getting assaulted a lot around their relationship with their body. But I do think that we have to develop, this is the aim part, develop a new legacy with regard to sexuality. So where do we want to go with regard to our sexuality and our relationship to our body and sexuality in our future? And so that is part of having that conversation. So now that you have the information, and now that you've begun to have a different relationship with your body, and as you think forward, what's beginning to come together for you now with regard to who you are, your relationships, a faith structure, if you have it, what's beginning to make sense now that you're sifting through what wasn't true for you, maybe wasn't true, and what is true, and you're kind of helping them sift through that. And that's part of why I wrote the book, is because that's what people were asking for.
Mm-hmm.
They were saying, what really did happen? Why did the church become sex negative? Was it always that way? Was there anything sex positive? And lo and behold, there were a whole mess of sex positive stories in mystic Hebrew writing that is beautiful, that just never was brought forward in the development of the Christian church at all. That's just beautiful. It's a total place that people can build a life on that monotheistic line. If they can't move towards the Eastern stuff, that stuff is just gorgeous and beautiful, and they can use that if that feels comfortable to them. And then they can move towards healing and integrating and finding something that feels comfortable to them. And I think therapists can be so helpful to people if they become familiar with that background and can have the cultural competence to help with that.
And if the therapist, have done the work to be aware of their own shame. And because that's unfortunately one of the things I see around the country is so many, 90% of therapists or more have no training in sexuality and never done any work to identify their own sexual shame. And then they can so inadvertently end up projecting and imposing it on their patients.
I know. It's one of my big soapboxes up here in the Northwest, and why I started the Northwest Institute on Intimacy is because we were down to like 5 sex therapists in the Northwest. And, we have 4, at least 4 master's programs in counseling or marriage and family therapy. That's not even counting our PhD programs. And, so you've got a bunch of people doing couples work. Nobody, including our physicians, has training in sexuality. And I said, this is ridiculous. We're going to have some training in sexuality up here. And you cannot get out of any of my courses without hearing me go off on a rant about you. I will never refer to you ever if you don't go on and get training in sexuality, because you can never be a good couples therapist or even a therapist to a family or anyone if you don't have more training than my one class.
Right.
It's just not enough. You know, I'm good, but I'm not that good.
I think that's so important.
Yeah.
So let me ask you one last question, and this is a hard question that I get asked a lot, is, aren't there some things that people should be ashamed of? Should we give up, shaming people for some things that are just completely inappropriate? And I really wrestle with that, because ultimately it's kind of asking the question, well, if we're not going to shame people for doing things that we all agree are completely inappropriate, like rape or violating sexual consent, what are we going to do?
I think that I have strayed away from sort of using that word shame in that way, because I think that it's important for people to get clear about what shame is and what guilt is. And so I think I don't use that word like I'm going to shame you. But I do think it's important that we have very clear language around actions and words that are unjust and hurtful and painful to people. And that we're very clear, and that we have clear words and clear actions. And if we are a person of power in our community, that we use that power towards good. So I don't tend to say I'm going to use that power to shame people, but I am certainly going to come out and say, I believe that's wrong. I believe that's hurtful. And this is how I believe it's wrong. And this is how I believe it's hurtful. And this is the research behind it. And this is the evidence of it. And I will be very clear and very bold in that way. But you won't probably hear me say, I'm shaming you, or you should be ashamed of that. That's just not language I'm wanting to use, because I'm wanting to be very clear about the difference between shame and guilt, and how we shame children and what that does to their self-esteem. I have this very core belief that we come into the world, all people come into the world beloved, like very valuable, like radically valuable and radically imperfect, all of us. And that to the degree that we can hold that as precious and then try to do something to actually better ourselves and then better our world, that's a good thing. And so I try to be careful with my language, because I'm committed to us doing something with that. So I have lots of other language I can use when I believe that people are doing things that are incredibly unjust and hurtful. And so I'll use other language probably.
I like all of that. And so rather than shaming all those therapists that don't have sexual training, we can be more effective by helping them understand how they ended up as a therapist without that training, and now offering them options to cure that breach, and helping them understand how it impedes their ability to be good therapists.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm incredibly compassionate. I say, honey, there's no way you're going to be able to be a good therapist. You grew up in the United States. You did. We have had no comprehensive sex education. We've been effed up with regards to sexuality and intimacy our entire history as a country. We have been selling people to sell our economy the entire time. So unless you grew up in a European immigrant home, which I actually had the good fortune to do, you're probably not going to have a different relationship with bodies and sexuality other than there was probably a lot of reactive people around you. And so because of that, you're going to need to be really intentional to do your work. That's okay. We all have a list of work we've got to do. Welcome to life and the human condition, so own it, do your work, be the best therapist you can be. My job is to say, here's where I live in the United States. How can I help with this? And that's part of why I feel like I was chosen, because I did grow up in the home that I did. I feel really comfortable teaching around sexuality. And so I ended up doing it, in part because I was comfortable, doing the training.
I'm so glad you're doing it. And I really feel honored you sharing this with me. And I'm really happy to have you on this side as we all kind of move forward trying to address this and help people kind of recover from especially the trauma and the damage that we did through abstinence-only education.
No kidding. Yeah.
Tina's book is Sex, God, and the Conservative Church. Tina, thanks for writing this, and I can't wait to see where things go for you from here.
Great. Thanks, David. This was so much fun.